Imagine losing a global war. Your 1,000-year empire is currently burning to the ground. Your heavily fortified cities are reduced to smoldering piles of brick, and you are sitting on a cheap canvas chair inside a cold, muddy Allied prisoner of war camp. Yet your ego is still so massively inflated, your brain so completely poisoned by years of ideological propaganda and supreme arrogance, that you look your heavily armed American captors dead in the eye and formally demand a birthday cake. You actually expect them to bake for you. Most victorious commanders would simply laugh in your face at the sheer absurdity of the request. Some might throw you straight into solitary confinement for the incredible disrespect. But General George S. Patton was not like most commanders. He decided to personally deliver that cake. Today we are going to uncover the deeply hilarious, brutally physical, and intensely psychological moment when the absolute peak of Nazi arrogance collided violently with America's most unfiltered, unapologetic warrior. We are going to explore exactly how a simple, sweet pastry was transformed into a devastating weapon of total psychological humiliation. Before we break down this incredible, untold clash of egos, I need you to do something. If you crave the raw, unfiltered, deeply human stories of history that the standard textbooks are far too polite to print, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. Also, I want to test your initial reaction to this madness. If you had just fought across a continent, watched your friends die, and a captured enemy commander demanded a luxury pastry from you, how would you react? Type the word delusional in the comments right now if you think this is the most out-of-touch request in military history. We read every single comment, and your engagement is the only reason we can keep ripping down these historical walls. Let us set the psychological stage. To truly comprehend the absolute audacity of this moment, you have to mentally place yourself inside the suffocating, tense atmosphere of an American prisoner of war holding area in the final bloody chapters of the European theater. The physical environment was a miserable, sprawling landscape of churned, freezing mud, rusted barbed wire, and endless rows of damp canvas tents. The American GIs guarding this specific camp were completely exhausted, shell-shocked young men who had spent the last 11 months fighting a relentless, grinding war of attrition across 2 continents. They were functioning on absolutely zero sleep, surviving on cold, tasteless, heavily processed field rations, and shivering in rain-soaked, filthy uniforms that smelled permanently of diesel fuel, dried sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder. They had watched their closest friends bleed out in the snows of the Ardennes forest. They had fought house to house through the booby-trapped ruins of German cities, and they had just fought their way through a literal living hell to capture these high-ranking German officers. And yet, sitting directly across the razor wire from these exhausted, traumatized American boys were the captured generals and senior commanders of the crumbling Third Reich. These were men who had spent the last decade being treated like literal, untouchable demigods by their own people. Even in the face of total, undeniable military defeat, many of these high-ranking officers clung desperately and pathetically to their twisted, deeply ingrained illusions of racial superiority and aristocratic military privilege. They walked around the muddy enclosures of the prison camps with their backs perfectly straight, their custom-tailored uniforms meticulously brushed free of dirt, and their heavy metal iron crosses proudly displayed against their collars. They looked down at their heavily armed American captors with undisguised contempt, treating the young soldiers from Ohio and Brooklyn as if they were nothing more than an uncultured, temporary nuisance who had simply gotten lucky on the battlefield. They fundamentally believed, down to their very marrow, that because of their high military rank and their supposed genetic destiny, they were still entirely entitled to a certain level of aristocratic luxury, unquestioning obedience, and absolute respect. They completely, conveniently ignored the terrifying reality that their ruthless military machine had just plunged the entire globe into an ocean of blood and suffering. The psychological disconnect between their actual situation and their perceived status was staggering to witness. It was an environment ripe for a catastrophic clash of realities. It was entirely inside this bizarre, highly tense bubble of supreme psychological denial that a captured German commander awoke one freezing morning, looked at his pocket calendar, realized it was the anniversary of his birth, and decided to flex his imagined, non-existent authority over his captors. Instead of quietly keeping his head down and being grateful that he had survived the deadliest conflict in human history, this general decided to assert his dominance in the most absurd way imaginable. He carefully adjusted his pristine tunic, smoothed back his hair, confidently approached the exhausted American guards stationed at the wire, and formally, seriously, requested that a high-quality birthday cake be immediately prepared by the camp kitchens and presented to him in his quarters to properly mark the occasion of his birth. He did not ask politely, he demanded it. He cited his rank, his officer privileges, and the supposed rules of gentlemanly warfare. He genuinely believed that he was successfully asserting his dominance over the camp. He thought he was brilliantly proving that even in the humiliating chains of captivity, a high-ranking general of the glorious German Reich still commands absolute respect and service from his inferiors. I want you to pause right now and put yourself directly into the heavy, mud-caked combat boots of the young American camp commander who was suddenly handed that ridiculous handwritten piece of paper. You are sitting at a folding wooden table in a freezing command tent, holding a formal requisition for a luxury birthday cake from a man whose army just spent the last 4 years actively trying to exterminate you and everyone you care about. The sheer, blinding insult of the request is enough to make the blood completely boil in your veins. What is your immediate, unfiltered gut reaction? Do you crumple the paper up into a ball, march directly into the holding pen, and throw it violently into his smug face? Or do you drag him out of his tent and make him scrub the overflowing camp latrines with a toothbrush for the rest of the month as a brutal, unforgettable reality check? Type the word ignore in the comments if you would just tear the ridiculous request up and leave him to rot. Or type the word punish if you would instantly throw that arrogant commander into a freezing isolation cell to teach him a lesson about who actually won the war. Your personal reaction tells us a massive amount about how you naturally handle psychological warfare, because the highly unorthodox way this specific request was actually handled by the American High Command is an absolute masterclass in completely breaking a human being's spirit without ever having to fire a single bullet or break a single rule of the Geneva Convention. Instead of being immediately thrown in the trash or burned in a designated burn barrel, this incredibly absurd demand somehow managed to survive. It was passed from a bewildered corporal to a furious sergeant, then to a highly confused captain, working its way up the chaotic, disorganized military chain of command, simply because nobody knew exactly how to properly process a formal requisition for a pastry from a prisoner of war. Eventually, this surreal piece of paper landed squarely onto the large wooden desk of General George S. Patton, the commander of the United States Third Army. Now, to truly appreciate what happens next, you absolutely must understand the exact, highly volatile psychological state that General Patton was operating in during this specific period of the spring of 1945. Patton was a man who already harbored a visceral, burning, almost physical hatred for the Nazi regime. But in recent weeks, that hatred had been magnified to absolute apocalyptic levels of fury. Patton had just recently walked through the freshly liberated, blood-soaked gates of the Ohrdruf concentration camp, a subcamp of the Buchenwald network. He had seen the horrors of the Holocaust with his own 2 eyes. He had walked past the rotting, emaciated corpses that were stacked like cordwood in the freezing mud. He had seen the terrifying, blood-stained torture devices, the starving, hollow-eyed survivors who looked like living skeletons, and the absolute, undeniable depths of pure human evil, orchestrated by the very men who were now sitting comfortably, demanding baked goods in American POW camps. The unspeakable horrors of Ohrdruf had shaken the famously hardened warrior so deeply to his core that he had literally turned away from his staff and vomited against a wooden wall in pure, uncontrollable disgust. He had become so enraged by the horrific sights that he had forced the mayor of the local German town and his wife to walk through the camp and witness the slaughter they had ignored. The couple went home that evening and hanged themselves in their own basement. Patton did not view these captured German officers as honorable, defeated rivals who deserved the traditional courtesies of gentlemanly warfare. He viewed them as cowardly, arrogant, deeply evil monsters who deserved absolutely no mercy, no respect, no comfort, and certainly no luxury. So when General Patton looked down at his desk and read a piece of paper formally requesting a beautiful birthday cake for a captured high-ranking German general, he did not just get angry. He did not simply scream, tear up the paper, and order the man to be beaten. Instead, Patton experienced a sudden moment of dark, brilliant, highly calculated psychological inspiration. He realized, with the sharp instinct of a master tactician, that simply denying the cake, tearing up the requisition, or screaming at the prisoner would actually be a failure. It would just reinforce the German general's deeply held belief that the Americans were uncultured, undisciplined brutes who did not understand military honor. It would perversely allow the arrogant Nazi to maintain his twisted internal sense of dignity, martyrdom, and victimhood. Patton wanted to strip that precious dignity away entirely. He wanted to inflict a very specific, highly embarrassing, and permanent type of psychological trauma that the man would never be able to forget. So, in a shocking move that completely baffled his own loyal staff officers and confused the camp guards, Patton gave a direct, unwavering, and incredibly bizarre order to the camp's busy mess hall cooks: bake the cake. He explicitly ordered them to use their precious, highly rationed supplies of real sugar, actual white flour, and thick, sweet vanilla frosting. He did not want a cheap, thrown-together military ration. He demanded a massive, beautiful, highly decorated, multi-tiered pastry masterpiece. He was going to let this arrogant, captured prisoner believe for just a few fleeting, glorious moments that he had actually won the psychological battle and asserted his dominance over the mighty United States Army. The anticipation inside the dreary, rain-soaked prisoner camp was incredibly tense and palpable. Word had quickly spread among the guards and the prisoners that the Americans were actually preparing to fulfill the general's ridiculous demand. Inside his designated, heavily guarded canvas tent, the German commander was undoubtedly sitting with a deeply smug, overwhelmingly self-satisfied smile plastered across his face. He had made a totally ridiculous, completely out-of-touch demand, and the weak, democratic, supposedly inferior Americans were actually bowing to his military rank and fulfilling it without question. He probably stood up, carefully adjusted the stiff, uncomfortable collar of his pristine field tunic, meticulously straightened the shiny silver medals on his chest, and prepared himself to graciously accept the tribute he genuinely believed he rightfully deserved from his captors. He fully expected a civilized, polite, officer-to-officer exchange. He anticipated a brief moment of gentlemanly warfare, perhaps a crisp salute and a formal presentation, an event that would entirely validate his twisted worldview and prove his inherent superiority. He waited patiently, listening to the heavy footsteps approaching his tent in the thick mud. Suddenly, the heavy canvas flap of the tent was violently, aggressively ripped open, letting in a blast of freezing outside air. But it wasn't a nervous, trembling young private carrying a silver tray who stepped through the entrance. It was General George S. Patton himself. He ducked his tall frame into the small space, his iconic, polished ivory-handled revolvers strapped tightly to his waist, his legendary lacquered helmet gleaming in the dim light, and his piercing, terrifying eyes burning with an intense, barely contained volcanic fury. And there, resting in his large, calloused, battle-scarred hands, Patton was holding a beautiful, massive, perfectly baked, heavily frosted birthday cake. The sudden silence that fell over the small room was absolute, heavy, and completely deafening. The German commander immediately stood up at attention, likely deeply confused by the presence of the legendary American commander, but still stubbornly maintaining his incredibly arrogant, stiff-backed posture. He waited for the American general to speak, perhaps expecting Patton to offer a stiff, formal greeting or a reluctant acknowledgement of his birthday. But Patton did not say a single, solitary word. He did not offer a crisp military salute. He did not smile. He simply walked with heavy, deliberate, terrifyingly slow steps directly toward the captured, arrogant officer. The German stood completely still, unsure of how to react to this highly unprecedented situation. Before the German general could even properly process the terrifying, homicidal look in Patton's eyes, or even begin to raise his hands to defend his face, Patton moved with an explosive, shocking, completely unexpected level of violent kinetic speed. He swung his arm forward, slammed his heavy, incredibly strong hand onto the back of the German commander's pristine, perfectly groomed head, and violently, mercilessly shoved the man's face directly down into the exact center of the massive, beautiful cake. Patton didn't just push him and step back. He grabbed the back of the man's neck and actively held him down. He drove the highly arrogant officer's face deep into the thick, sickeningly sweet layers of sticky vanilla frosting, the crushed, moist sponge cake, and the heavy cream. He physically pinned the struggling, suffocating man's face against the rough wood of the table, letting the absolute, crushing, devastating humiliation of the moment sink entirely into the atmosphere of the room. The German's hands flailed wildly, trying to find purchase, but Patton's grip was like an iron vice. Only when Patton felt the point had been thoroughly, undeniably made, did he finally, casually release his incredibly tight grip. The German commander immediately stumbled backward, gasping heavily for air, coughing up chunks of sweet cake, his eyes wide with absolute shock and pure, unadulterated terror. The visual scene left behind in that tent was utterly devastating, not because of any permanent physical pain or injury, but because of the absolute total and complete destruction of a human being's ego. The terrifying, aristocratic master of the Third Reich, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the belief that he was genetically, culturally, and militarily superior to absolutely everyone else in the room, was standing there trembling. Thick, sticky white frosting was dripping profusely from his nose and chin, his eyelashes were completely caked in heavy sugar, and large, wet chunks of vanilla sponge were entirely ruining the front of his pristine, carefully brushed, metal-covered uniform. The Iron Cross, the ultimate symbol of his supposed military glory, was completely buried under a thick layer of cheap American baking cream. He didn't look like a terrifying conqueror anymore. He didn't look like a brilliant tactician or an honored prisoner of war. He looked like an absolute clown. He looked completely ridiculous, entirely pathetic, and utterly, profoundly powerless. Patton stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, staring a hole straight through the humiliated, frosting-covered man, letting the heavy, suffocating silence do absolutely all of the necessary talking. He had taken the man's ultimate, arrogant symbol of entitlement, the birthday cake he believed he deserved, and had literally, violently smashed it into a devastating weapon of total psychological ruin. Patton didn't have to break the rules of the Geneva Convention to prove his dominance. He didn't have to lay a finger on the man in a traditional bloody beating. He simply broke the man's entire soul, permanently shattered his deeply held delusion of superiority, and completely erased his dignity, using nothing more than a freshly baked good. Without ever uttering a single syllable to the ruined officer, Patton turned sharply on his heel, pushed open the canvas flap, and confidently walked out of the tent, leaving the sticky, gasping general to stand entirely alone in the pathetic, sugary wreckage of his own massive, destroyed ego. This incredibly bizarre, highly physical, and utterly hilarious confrontation is absolutely not just a funny, entertaining anecdote from the final days of the war. It is a profound, deeply educational lesson in the devastating, undeniable power of targeted psychological warfare. General Patton, for all his flaws and his legendary explosive temper, deeply understood human nature. He understood that for arrogant, narcissistic men whose entire core identity is built on a fragile foundation of absolute arrogance, rigid military hierarchy, and unearned pride, physical pain or imprisonment is often far less terrifying than public, undeniable, and permanent humiliation. A physical beating would have allowed the German general to maintain his internal narrative. He could have told himself he was a strong, stoic martyr, suffering at the hands of brutal captors. But you cannot be a stoic, honorable martyr when you have vanilla frosting dripping out of your nostrils and cake stuffed in your ears. By actually granting the ridiculous request, only to instantly, violently turn it into a humiliating slapstick joke, Patton stripped away the one single thing the German general had left to hold on to, his delusion of control and superiority. It was the ultimate, deeply satisfying form of instant historical karma for the unbelievable arrogance of a totalitarian regime that had forcefully demanded the entire world bow down to it, only to end up with a face full of cheap frosting in a muddy, freezing canvas tent. It proved once and for all that sometimes the absolute most effective, devastating way to permanently break a dangerous enemy isn't with a high-caliber bullet, an artillery shell, or a dropping bomb, but by forcibly holding up a harsh, brutally embarrassing mirror to their own ridiculous, self-important delusions. As we finally close the heavy history book on this incredible, unfiltered, and deeply satisfying moment of historical karma, I want to hear your final, honest verdict on General Patton's highly unorthodox methods of prisoner management. Was this the absolute perfect, most brilliant, and psychologically devastating way to handle an arrogant, unrepentant war criminal? Or do you think the man who proudly commanded the terrifying horrors of the German military machine actually deserved a much darker, much more violent, and permanently physical punishment? I want you to head down to the comment section right now and cast your final vote in this historical debate. Type the word justice if you firmly think Patton's legendary cake smash was the ultimate hilarious ego death that perfectly, poetically fit the crime of arrogance. Or type the word worse if you fiercely believe the captured Nazi commander deserved far, far more than just a ruined uniform, a bruised ego, and a sticky face. We actively read absolutely every single perspective, and your powerful voice is exactly what drives this fascinating historical debate forward into the future. Thank you for joining us today as we dig deep past the sterilized, boring propaganda and the polite, sanitized history books to find the raw, beating heart of true human conflict. These are the intense, unforgettable stories of psychological warfare, brutal, instantaneous karma, and the unforgiving, complex reality of the human condition that you simply will not ever find in a standard classroom lecture. If you truly want to keep exploring the intense, unfiltered, and deeply shocking truths of the men and women who lived, fought, and completely broke their enemies through the world's greatest conflicts, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now so you never miss an episode. Your continued support, your passionate comments, and your daily engagement are the absolute only reasons we can keep bringing these legendary, untold, and highly suppressed moments back to life for a new generation. Stay incredibly curious, stay fiercely objective, and always, always remember that in the great, chaotic, unpredictable theater of human history, the most devastating, world-altering blows are very often the ones that permanently shatter the mind, not the body. We will see you in the next video. Stay strong.